Hi friends, welcome back to Hebraic Creations. Last time we left off with the Old Testament messianic prophecy in Malachi chapter 4 verse 2. But to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. Wings is the English translation of the Hebrew word kanaf, which is Strong's number 3671. We want to look now for two things in the New Testament. First, we want to see where this messianic healing prophecy was fulfilled. And second, we want to see if there are other places in the New Testament that talks about tzitzit. Let's lay some groundwork. The Hebrew word tzitzit was translated into the Greek word kraspedon. That's Strong's number 2899. The Greek word kraspedon was then translated into two different English phrases in the King James Version. First, hem of the garment. Second, border of the garment. So the fulfillment of the Malachi prophecy happens when people are healed by touching the hem or border of Yeshua's garment, meaning his tzitzit or tassels. I think we're all familiar with the story of the woman with the issue of blood. The account is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew chapter 9, verse 20 through 22. Let's read. Behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood for 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment, kraspedon. For she said within herself, if I may but touch his garment, I will be whole. Notice in this account the word used for tassels is hem. In Luke chapter 8, verses 43 to 44, the word used for tassels is border. Notice here also that Yeshua says power went out of him. Then in Mark chapter 5, verse 25 to 29, there's an account that's very similar, but the word kraspedon is omitted. But I want to highlight that in verse 29, the woman was said to be healed of her plague. Pay attention to that word. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Mark notes also that Yeshua felt virtue go out of him when the woman touched his tzitzit. So in 2 of 3 accounts, there's emphasis that Yeshua felt something supernatural happen. On page 127 of the Chronological Gospels, Michael Rood expounds on this woman's experience. He says the garment Yeshua was wearing was a tallit, a four-cornered seamless garment worn by Israelites over their white linen haluk or robe, and the tassels were attached to its four corners. There are more scripture accounts that highlight the healing power in Yeshua's tasseled tallit. We need to look at Matthew chapter 14, verses 35 to 36, and I will read from the corrected King James Version. When the men of that place knew he was there, they sent out into all the country round about and brought to him all that were diseased. They begged him that they might just touch the tzitzit on the corner of his garment, and as many as touched them were made perfectly whole. There's a parallel passage in Mark chapter 6, verses 56. And after this woman's healing, what we conclude is that the word must have spread around because everywhere he went, everyone wanted to touch his tassels, and whoever did so was healed. Because Yeshua told his followers they would do greater works than he, could our obedience to wear tzitzit be an avenue for healing miracles today? Oh, that would be great. The last place we find kraspedon in the Gospels is Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 5, where Yeshua criticizes the religious leaders for making their tassels super long. They wanted to look more spiritual than everybody else, I guess. Jesus is not criticizing them for simply having them, just for making them extremely long. The King James Version says they enlarged the borders of their garments instead of lengthen their tzitzit. I always thought this was strange. Why would they bother to do that when the Torah says nothing about garments having a certain size border or hem? But there is a stipulation to make tassels on the four corners of their garment, which brings a lot more clarity to these poorly translated passages. Okay, so there are 5 places where a tassel tallit is found in the Gospels. Now, let's look at one place noted by Michael Rood in the corrected King James Version that's not so obvious. This is in John chapter 19, verse 23. In the corrected King James, I'll read. When the soldiers crucified Yeshua, they took his garments and divided his linen haluk, or robe, into 4 parts, and each soldier received a part. But his tallit was seamless, woven continuously from the top. They said among themselves, "Let's not rend it, but cast lots." This was a fulfillment of the prophecy in Psalm 22:18, if you want to look that up. Another passage that pertains to Tzitzit is the account of Lydia. It's in Acts chapter 16, verse 14. Again, corrected King James Version. There was a certain woman of the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a seller of techelet, who worshipped Yehovah. In the King James, instead of a seller of techelet, it reads a seller of purple, which is the Greek word porphyra, which is Strong's number 4211. The word techelet in Hebrew is blue and is found 49 times in the Old Testament, and that's Strong's number 8504. It mostly describes the drapery in the tabernacle and the priest's clothing. Michael Rood explains his choice of blue over purple for this New Testament passage on page 306 of the Chronological Gospels. He says a very expensive purple dye was extracted from the hypochondrial gland of the Hilazon snail. It was used to color the garments of Roman royalty. If the gland was crushed under the ultraviolet rays of the sun, the dye turned a beautiful sky blue and was used to color the blue thread on the 4 wings of the tallit. In Lydia's day, the techelet dye was a black market commodity, and Roman law forbade its use by commoners. It seems many modern rabbis are not sure the Hilazon snails are the correct source, so many Jewish communities don't use any blue threads in the tzitzit at all, which, as I said before, is an example of lawlessness. The last New Testament scripture that points to tassels is Acts chapter 18, verses 3, and I'll read the corrected King James. Paul introduced himself to them, Priscilla and Aquila, and because they were of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked with them, for by their occupation they were tallit makers. The King James Version says tent makers, and that's the Greek word skena. That's Strong's number 4635. Michael Rood elaborates on page 310 of his book to explain his interpretation for tallit maker. He says tents were made of goat hair by Bedouin tribeswomen on huge looms that had to be transported by camels. Tent making would have been an impossible trade and completely impractical for travelers or Jewish city dwellers. Making tallit would have been a natural, acceptable, and profitable occupation for itinerant Jewish teachers. The tallit was later transformed into the prayer shawl and used as a prayer covering. If you've ever shopped for a prayer shawl in Israel, you will have noticed there are various sizes. The smaller ones are more of a souvenir for Holy Land pilgrims, whereas the larger ones are definitely the size of a small tent for the more serious observers. Michael Rood has a very logical perspective that makes sense to me, but you might want to test it. And if you want a little more detailed study of Tzitzit, I recommend the 119 Ministries video entitled Tzitzit FAQs. So let's recap. Clearly, there was incredible healing power and virtue associated with touching Yeshua's tassels. This is one more example of Yeshua being Torah observant and setting an example for us. I sense that the tassels are not only a reminder to us to obey the entire law, but they're also a point of contact with this supernatural presence of Yeshua. I also think the tassels are a reminder of Yehovah's blessings that come with obedience to the law. One blessing I want to highlight in light of the Malachi prophecy with which we started, it's the protection from sickness and disease. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 15. And the Lord will take away from you all sickness and will afflict you with none of the terrible diseases of Egypt. On the other hand, disobedience has the opposite effect. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 58 to 60. If you do not carefully observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, Yehovah, Then the Lord will bring upon you and your descendants extraordinary plagues, great and prolonged plagues, and serious and prolonged sicknesses. Moreover, he will bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they shall cling to you. Friends, this should be very sobering in light of the coronavirus plague. Obedience is following all the commandments, and it is a matter of life or death. We live in very troubling times, but Yeshua foretold these things right after reaming the Pharisees for their lawlessness in Matthew chapter 23. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 7 to 8. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. That's it for this session. Next time we may take a look at the dietary laws. Shalom.